Welcome to Tone Talks. How's everybody doing today? This is Antonio Moore coming to you from Tone Talks. I wanted to come to you to have a discussion about the state of wealth in America, how it's changed even in the last few years. Recently, the Federal Reserve released its new data, and I want to break that down. And I want to talk about how we're avoiding it all. And instead, what we'd rather do is watch the BET Awards and Megan Thee Stallion or Lil DaBaby, or the Clippers and the Phoenix Suns to see who goes to the NBA Finals. I don't think everybody understands the gravity of how this literally limits the ability for your children to have a future regarding any context of wealth in this America. Let's talk about it. So, less than a week ago, there was an announcement of how U.S. household wealth has jumped. In that announcement, they really didn't talk about how it's really pretty much all white household wealth, but also barely anybody picked it up. So the announcement was U.S. household wealth jumps to record $136.9 trillion, the Fed says. When they talk about the Fed, they're talking about the Federal Reserve. The numbers I'm going to give you come from the Federal Reserve. Part of the, problem with Black America is that we haven't dealt with the reality of what it means to be Black in America. And particularly when I say Black America, I'm talking about ADOS Black America. Because oftentimes when you come from different countries, there's a whole nother narrative of how your wealth flows, the potential for your wealth to grow in those other countries, and all kind of other narratives. Here in America, I think Black Americans, ADOS Black Americans, have survived on not knowing the data and the information. Much of what my project has been is to explain that data. I haven't seen enough movement inside of Black communities and Black families. I've seen a lot of head ducking. I've seen a lot of chest pounding. I've seen a lot of statements of it doesn't matter because I'm a lineage build or crypto or anything else, while white folks have basically changed all the rules around you. So while you're talking about building wealth, they're simply talking about growing what they already got by changing the rules. Part of this video is going to explain to you at different levels how they set the rules up where it doesn't matter what your individual life actions are. It only matters that you break it up with reparative justice programs both at the federal level and in federal pressure to change the way local policy is done through a national reparative justice movement. So, U.S. household wealth jumps to a record $136.9 trillion. Barely anybody covers it. One of the most important news pieces in the last 12 months other than coronavirus, and one of the most important news pieces in the last 5 years in context of how wealth has grown. But barely anybody covers it. But everybody can cover Britney's conservatorship. Everybody can cover the BET Awards and what Megan Thee Stallion was wearing. Everybody can cover Paul George's pandemic pee. What we don't understand is the reason why they can cover all of that, because you can't know this. Because if you know this, if you know the state of wealth, you might get real frustrated and start to really get in the streets, not just over George Floyd's death, but over your own child's life potential. So we start to see this thing June 10th. U.S. household wealth jumped to a record $136.9 trillion at the end of March. A report from the Federal Reserve showed on Thursday suggesting plenty of dry tinder for economic growth as the coronavirus pandemic recedes and the nation reopens. Rising equity markets drove the overall increase in wealth, adding $3.2 trillion to household assets in the first quarter. What I'm going to show you is how that's almost all white wealth, and how you can't do this anymore. You can't have children and leave them nothing. You can't talk about tomorrow. You got to tell me what's in the account tonight. Not do politics. You can, but I'm just telling you it's going to get real rough in your household. If it ain't already. You can't have your 20-year-old working at Walmart or driving Uber for that matter, and you just duck your head in the sand like this don't matter. Their life potential has been stranglehold by a white wealth policy setting system that has basically subjugated us to a second-class citizenship without the picket signs. They don't need to stand in your yard anymore. Now what they can do is just do it through policy and state tax, through local property tax not going up while their properties go up. Rising real estate values added around $1 trillion according to U.S. Central Bank's last quarterly report on household businesses and government financial accounts. Overall, U.S. household wealth rose $5 trillion from the fourth quarter. Balances in cash, checking accounts, and savings deposits swelled by about a combined $850 billion in the first quarter to a record $14.5 trillion, the report showed, bolstered by massive government aid aimed at blunting the economic fallout from the pandemic and bringing families to the other side of the crisis. So America made a decision that white folks wasn't going to fail. They wasn't going to fail. This is the second time in our adult life that they've made that kind of decision. They were going to undergird their businesses, small and large, loans, PPP, and other sort. They did this during the recession by undergirding businesses, by undergirding stock values, by undergirding banks. If you're about 40, during your adult life, they've interjected themselves twice when white folks were supposed to fail. During the recession, and then again during the pandemic. White wealth was supposed to collapse during the recession, and Obama decided, along with the banks, that wasn't going to happen. I need you to understand we're going to have this discussion based on Twitter posts that I posted throughout the last few weeks to contextualize what wealth has done in regard to race. Here's the new pie chart of wealth distribution by race I made from the Federal Reserve data. Whites now have $115 trillion and blacks have about $6 trillion. But $4 trillion of that black wealth is real estate or pension. Again, Black America only has $6 trillion in wealth. White America has 115. Understand there are 83 million white homes and there are about 20 million black. That's about a 1-to-4 ratio. 6 trillion to 115 trillion is not a 1-to-4 ratio. Understand that in addition of the 4 trillion is in pension and homes. That tells you that that is not in liquid assets. That's the first thing, but it's pretty much in old black people's hands. The fundamental thing that younger millennial and Gen X blacks don't want to accept is you're much more educated than your parents, but have substantially less, and that is a direct result of policy. We have allowed people to tell us that we don't work hard enough or we didn't save when it was a failure of policy. I'm going to show you how through the estate tax, basically, black boomers dropped the ball. They allowed white people to keep all of their wealth and then left us nearly none. That's what happened. So we look at this wealth, and 75% is in the hand of our wealth as black folks is in the hand of our top 10% of families. So if you looked at it across deciles of the little slither that we have, 75% of the little slither we have is in the hands of the top 10% of black families. We probably have about 4% of the wealth now, about 4%, and white folks have about 85%, 84%. Looking at the pie chart that I created, it shows we have 4.1%, white folks have 84%. But understand that if you were to look at it by deciles, that would like 75% of that 4% is in the top 10% of black families, or 2 million of the 20 million black families, primarily old pensioners, regardless of education, oftentimes not even finishing high school. Just timed and then decided I'm not going to do no politics. And then you have in the top 20% of black families, you have 90% of that wealth. The bottom half of the race is worth less than $1 combined. And that is where a lot of your black college educated people are, regardless of whether it's just graduating college or 40 years old, because oftentimes they never paid the student debt off. This was a long time. So we have 4.1% of the wealth. Doing the math roughly, if you were to talk about it, you can say almost 3.6% of that is in the hands of the top 20% of our families. Almost all boomer retirees. So structurally, even within family, we have the Congressional Black Caucus, which comes directly out of these families in the top 10%, pensioners, homeowners, speaking for the rest of us and saying nothing right because they don't even know. They don't understand the wealth. Displayed over time, white families had $22 trillion. That's all they had in 1990. Then they had $67 trillion in 2008. I'm speaking from the Federal Reserve Consumer Finances data that comes out. They have a chart that came out that shows you over time by quarter how much whites, blacks, Latinos, and others have. I'm focusing on whites and blacks. Understand, in 1990, they had, white America, $22 trillion. By 2008, they have $67 trillion. Played over time, white families had $22 trillion in 1990. They had $67 trillion in 2008 when Obama takes office. They now have $115 trillion. That is over many of our lifetimes. And the CBC wants to celebrate making Juneteenth a holiday while we're owed trillions. I want to get into some specifics. When you look at this thing, you look at it and you see the growth. It's not a natural growth. That growth is a direct result of a decision. And I would argue that decision is we can't have good white folk having to picket black folks in their neighborhood. So what we're going to do is we're going to hide it all. We're going to hide all the racism in advantageous policy that allows them to not pay property tax at the correct rate. Policy that allows them to retain their estates at levels that we've never allowed them to retain it throughout the entirety of American history, including Jim Crow. Policy that allows them during a recession that collapses America to basically gain so much wealth through quantitative easing, which is America deciding to give them reparative justice. Basically, quantitative easing during Obama's years gave white retirees millions of dollars to then hand to their millennials. And that's what people live on now. They don't live just on labor. Not in the top 30% of white America, let alone the top 5 to 10% of black America. They live on basically a chunk of money that Obama and Trump gave to these families that they now give to their millennial working age children, their Gen X young working age children. I need everybody to kind of see it because we're having this discussion and we got to look at it. In 1989, to look at quarter 3 of the specific, white America has $21.1 trillion. From slavery to Jim Crow to 1989, they got to 21. Black America had $0.96 trillion. In 08, white America has $66.72 trillion. So basically from 1988 to 08, they jumped all the way to $66.72 trillion. Black America has 3.45 at that point. In 19, white America has now jumped between 08 and 19 to nearly $100 trillion. Black America has 5.67. But inside of that black number, you have to remember, ours is almost all pension and home. So it's basically like black boomers basically being like kind of locked in by white folks. I believe largely it was a subtle nod to keep them quiet politically. And like as a result, it's basically left us eating up whole, holding a bag of student debt, left without any kind of real inheritance as millennial people that graduated from everything from college to medical school and law school. And I think for a lot of us, we get caught up in rhetoric, not knowing the numbers. And that rhetoric is told to us by people who say, well, in my day, I did this and this and this. No, the government did this for you. I want to make sure everybody understands that for a long time, they didn't give wealth data. They just gave income. I know this because Thomas Shapiro, author of Black Wealth, White Wealth, came on my channel and we had a discussion about so many different topics, and I appreciate him coming on. He came up with the term racial wealth gap. I advised him that was the wrong term, and he agreed. It should never been called a gap because it's not. I don't know what it is. Man, it's not even a chasm. It's just blackness and whiteness. And it's going to get ever clearer as we go forward. God help you if you have kids and you don't have 50 to 75,000 for each one of them in an account. And that's just the start. And that's presuming they're 8 or 9 and that money can grow. Because we are in a new day. And I don't know if everybody understands how real that new day is because it's moved so fast over basically the course of one life. And I'm going to use that life starting in about mid-70 and that life basically going to right now. It's a whole new world in terms of wealth. When you look at wealth, they gave us income number until the 90s because they didn't want to tell us how much more white people had. But then like the pressure came, and a lot of pressure more recently came as a result of projects like my own. See, I just reached out to the Federal Reserve data less than 2 days ago. I don't know what you do at night. I don't know if it's learning how to watch basketball and teach somebody how to dribble a ball back and forth, or it's learning how the notes of Megan Thee Stallion song. I know at night I'm doing this and I don't have a child. You don't get to do nothing but this because this is the whole ball game now. Whether you understand it now or later, if your kid is driving Uber at night, that means that he is basically economically collapsed. People will say, white kids are driving Uber too. Well, by the time you get to the end of this show, you'll understand. Oftentimes, they waiting for that money if they're in the top 30. Because we know, look, let's frame everything so everybody can stop with their narrative. Well, there's poor white people too. Those people ain't trying to go to UCLA. Those people are not trying to become medical doctors. Those people are not necessarily trying to buy homes in this market. Come on, let's talk about it. So when we talk about like white America, stop telling me about the worst of white America and tell me about the middle. Tell me about the top 30. When we look at white America, they have 83 million homes. Roughly speaking, almost 30 to 35% of them have more than $700,000 of those homes. 30 to 35%. So we're talking, I'm roughing it right now, but if there's 83 million homes, we're talking over 23 million, 24 million homes with over $700,000. There's 20 million black homes. Only 5% are worth more than $350,000. That's according to Citibank. 5%. Out of the 20 million black homes, only 350,000 break $1 million. The reason I know is because I brought the data to you to tell you that. Because nobody else had before. Nobody had told you. How many black millionaires and how many white millionaires are there? I pulled the micro data with Matt Brunig, formerly of demos.org, and we do an article for you less than 3 years ago. The numbers are higher now. In that article, we showed you the numbers have exploded even since then. But in that article, we showed you basically that almost 1 million white families are above $12 million. Above $12 million. And almost 14 million, 13 million are above $1 million too. You know how many black families are above $1 million too? A single $1.2 million, counting their home though, not in an account. 350,000 out of the 20 million. And pretty much they're all boomer retirees. The idea of this young black millionaire has been so projected by sports through the decadent veil that it's confused you about the state of race itself. So white people don't have to pick it, and black people don't know that they're black wealth-wise. And we got a society where everybody's just running around here looking at Cheerios commercials thinking that everything's all right. But I'm going to tell you right now that we don't have to deal with the fact that we don't have the wealth data anymore. See, they gave us the income data until the 90s. So in the 80s, when we're watching the Cosby Show, as we start to watch the Fresher Prince, we don't know wealth. But now you see this reality where we can pull the data. See, before like 85, 87, it's even hard to get like overall wealth data. But when you look at it, generally speaking, I think that the overall number, was around 3 trillion in 1980, something like that. 3 trillion, 2 trillion, 4 trillion, something like that. It was that low. By 1990, whites alone have $21.63 trillion in household wealth. We have one. We move along, and we talked about it just a second ago, right? By 2010, they jumped to $63 trillion. Between 2010 and 2021, those 10 years, they doubled it. They now have almost $115 trillion in household wealth. But how it's broken down is just as important, the fact that they have it, because what you don't understand is that the reason they got it is because of policy. And how they have it broken down tells us that they own almost all of business. Our little money is all pension and homes again in the hands of boomer retirees that oftentimes might not have even a high school education. Even if we give them a high school education, they don't want to transfer the money and the wealth to their younger kids that are much more educated. We are locked out, locked inside, and left to almost economically pass out. Part of the issue with reparations is academics from economists to sociologists seem to have no idea of the scale. They seem to have no idea white America now has $115 trillion and blacks have 6, with 4 of it being pension and homes. 50% likely concentrated in black boomer pensions and homes. Just recently, you had the 30 banks come out today. 30 black banks. America's biggest banks detail 30 things they can do to combat racial inequality. None of it combats racial inequality. Basically, everybody's just kind of shrugging their shoulders and telling you anything. And part of the reason they're telling you anything is because you're watching the Clippers and Megan Thee Stallion. So if you're watching TikTok and talking about what the dancers get, Instead of talking about this real and this reality of this wealth and what this wealth is doing and calcifying, of course they're going to tell you anything. One of the things, let me read some of the things they said. They said, tying executive pay to diversity. Yet critics of big banks would argue that industry hasn't done enough to address inequality, including its own backyard. A study published in March by the Committee for Better Banks called the industry out for a lack of diversity in its upper ranks. Diversity includes white women, Latinos, black immigrants, and that's not about at all trying to be divisive, but we're talking about the cost that comes from U.S. slavery and Jim Crow. We've already talked about it, not to be redundant, about immigration patterns. Smithsonian, prior to 1960, the amount of black immigrants in America was to the right of the decimal. So they're not here for all of those costs. We're talking about the burden that comes and how it's been locked in through policy, pushing forward to people that didn't immigrate here, that were brought here and changed to be slaves here in America. So coming back to it, they're going to say diversity for the most elite little slither of people that are considered part of diversity is going to fix racial inequality that comes from slavery and Jim Crow. So you're going to give white women, Latinos, black immigrants some kind of advantage, the elite ones that are in your banks. And that helps with racial inequality. How? Why is this even in here? How is this even a point? Who even let this man talk about this and seem like he was making sense? It's so incoherent. Now, if you want to talk about that as separate from racial inequality and just talk about class policy or something else, that's fine. But don't never bring up reparations with diversity. So in addition, a $16 trillion problem, this is considered a second section. Wealth inequality is particularly glaring along racial lines. As of 2019, the median net worth of a white household was $188,000, or nearly 8 times that of black families. Again, I need everybody to know the numbers. I've shown you that what they're doing is playing a game when you actually use the Federal Reserve data that this relies on. What happens is that they'll use a $20,000 number for blacks, and they'll use $188 for whites. But what they won't show you is that 15 to 16,000 of that is family car for the black side. It's family car, clothes, and TV, depreciating assets that you're not supposed to count. So the black number is really like 3 or 4. The white number comes from 188 down to like 40, down like $40,000 to 140 if you take out those same depreciating assets. So it's really 4 against 140. It isn't 8 times. And they need to stop playing games and start knowing the numbers, because this is just nonsense. BPI called for banks to diversify the ranks of private bankers, financial advisors, and the salespeople to target investment in funds run by firms with diverse leadership. So diverse. Not ADOS, which means American descendants of slavery, to focus on those families that bear the cost of coming from slavery and Jim Crow, having been brought here on chains to this country. And so this bank and these banks, what they're doing is detailing 30 things that don't do anything for the racial wealth gap. The only thing that closes a gap this large is first to have a classification for ADOS, because it doesn't matter if you don't give it to the right people, which means it goes to those families that were slaves here in America and went through Jim Crow as well. But then in addition, to make sure that federal government gives them the wealth. Otherwise, whether you get, it's always going to be too small. We had a recent article today where some seminary, I believe in Virginia, decided to do $2,000 a year. Understand that $2,000 a year is the reparations they're saying they're giving, but in addition, it's going to be taxed at 40% because it's income. So you got to fill out 1099 on reparations. Just keep the $2,000 and push for policy from the federal government that acknowledges this group is special, and that then places this group in a special position to benefit from life, no different than white folks have in America. So, contextualizing these banks, these 30 banks talking about nonsense around reparations, or let me say racial wealth gap inequality, you have to understand the racial wealth gap. You look at the components of it, because we're going to break this out for right now. This is the newest chart, and we're going to break out the components so you can see what I said earlier about our wealth being almost all pension and homes. There's categories: real estate, consumer durables, corporate equities and mutual fund shares, pension entitlements, private business, and other assets. I recently talked to the Federal Reserve, and I found out that the other assets also includes some form of mutual funds as well. And also that's where your bank account cash, your cash would be held. So white America has 24 trillion. Again, 83 million white homes, 20 million black homes. 1-to-4 ratio. Look at this split. They have 24 trillion, 24.63 trillion in real estate. They have 4.88 trillion in consumer durables, which means like TVs, couches, everything else. You're talking about a car, things like that. 29.98 in corporate equities and mutual funds. That's your stocks, that's your bonds, everything else. You have 23.22 in pension entitlements. They have 11.33 in private businesses, small and medium-sized and large businesses. Some of these businesses are quite large and they just have never done stocks before. They have 20.93 in other assets. So that might be some money in bank accounts and some money in other kinds of funds. Blacks. We have 1.74 in real estate. That's it. We have 0.4 in durables. We have 0.37 in corporate equities and mutual funds. $370 billion is all we have in corporate equities and mutual funds. So no matter how many times someone like Boyce Watkins talks about stocks, it shows a literal lack of understanding of who and what we are in this country and how we've been positioned. It is basically selling you a pipe dream. Pension entitlements, $2.62 trillion in pension entitlements. So we only have about 6 altogether, and 2.62 is pensions. That's all boomer and older Gen Xers at best, but really boomer retirees, because younger people didn't get a chance to get a pension. So half our money almost is all pension. Half our money is all pension. They should almost take that out and just say we got 3 and we don't really have nothing. 0.27 of private is private business, and 0.93 is other assets. Again, let me slow it down so everybody, sometimes you got to slow charts down so everybody understands. I'm focusing on the breakdown of wealth in America. We talked about it being 115 and about 6 or so trillion between blacks and whites. We talked about the number of households, but now I'm looking at how it's categorically broken down. I want you to understand, slow down with me and see this. Almost half of our money is pensions. Only, less than 18% of their money, meaning white folks, is pensions? Think about it. I need you to see and understand that white families have $30 trillion in just stocks. Blacks altogether have $370 billion, with a B, in stocks. Then whites have another $11.3 trillion in private businesses. Black private businesses is only around $270 billion. That's that 0.27. They own nearly all business. Black wealth hardly exists. I've been telling you that for almost a decade now. Understand, if you come down to other assets, that's where our bank accounts are at. 0.93 altogether. That's not all bank account. So let's just say a quarter of that 250 billion liquid. It's not a misappropriation that we didn't buy the stocks, Boyce Watkins, or anyone else. This 3-card Monty where you make black people responsible for white policy, white oppression, where you make black people responsible for the fact that you don't understand ADOS. You just understand talking. All of that has been a con. It's been a manipulation of the reality of not knowing the numbers. This video is about the numbers. White Americans grew this wealth by creating policy that gave them reparation-sized transfers, from quirky property tax laws, as we'll talk about in a second in California and places like it, to business and capital gains tax breaks. Understand, 15% tax on capital gains, 40% tax on labor. Again, that money, that's 30 trillion in stocks, grows, and when you make the money, you can take it out at 15%. But if I go as an ADOS person and go work after law school and make $100,000, I got to pay 40% on that because nobody advocated for me. Let's talk. To business and capital gains tax breaks, to lenient estate tax laws nationally, let's talk about it. They have been paying themselves reparations for 50 years. They meaning white folks, white America. I'm going to break this down in layers. There's going to be 3 different layers. It's much more convoluted and complex than this, but just for simplicity's sake, for you to kind of see how it doesn't matter if you beat your chest. It doesn't matter if you say we going to be a lineage or a legacy, whatever y'all say with y'all families nowadays. It doesn't matter unless you break up the policy with a massive reparative justice movement. It's not just money. It's breaking up how white folks have calcified themselves into whiteness and advantage. So let's break it down in layers. Number one, federal policy done during economic tragedy. So we're talking about the kind of policies that's chosen during the recession, during the pandemic, and how that benefits white folks. Number two, federal policy done in normal times. We're talking about what is the policy choice on certain things during regular normal times, and how does that benefit white folks? We're going to lastly talk about local policy. And the example I'm going to use is the California property tax law passed in 1978 that basically made it so white folks could have $1 million houses and pay little to no property tax. And then for a long time until last year, they could pass it down to their children. Let's start off with the 2008 crash and then what Obama did, which is called quantitative easing. Does quantitative easing add to inequality? Income inequality is the notion that most of the nation's wealth is held by a small percentage of the people in the income upper class. While inequality is inevitable on some levels, central banks and governments around the world have been fighting its rise over the last 10 years. In response to the Great Recession, unconventional monetary policy named QE, quantitative easing, pushed asset prices to record highs, which began the endless inequality debate. Quantitative easing is different from traditional central banking policy. In the past, the Federal Reserve was tasked with buying or selling government bonds. Buying bonds injects money into the economy, and selling bonds takes money out of the economy. In this way, the Fed is able to control the supply of money. The more money that is injected into the economy, the lower the cost of money, interest rates. Therefore, low interest rates should lead to economic growth. Instead of pumping money into the economy via the purchase of government bonds, QE is the buying of mortgage-backed securities and treasury notes. In response to the financial crisis, the Federal Reserve conducted 3 rounds of QE, which saw the Fed's balance sheet swell to $4.5 trillion. The money was funneled into the economy through the capital markets, which resulted in higher corporate debt, which was used for acquisitions and stock buybacks, both of which helped to push stock prices higher. So Obama basically said we don't deserve reparations as ADOS people. Nobody should have to pay that. Then when the stock market crashed because of risk by white wealth, that's just what happened largely. White wealth was risky and it deserved to collapse. Instead of letting them collapse from their 60-something trillion dollars of wealth that they had, I believe they had about 62 when he comes into office, they should have collapsed down to 40. And now you have a readjustment. Or even 30. Instead of doing that, he basically undergirded their wealth and boosted it. Now, while he did that, he also failed to help black homeowners, black and white, but particularly it impacted blacks because so much of our wealth is in homes. I just showed it to you earlier. New report looks at how Obama's housing policies destroyed black wealth. The first black president in American history was a disaster for black wealth, authors of the think tank report wrote. Again, Matt Brunig actually authored this. I did a report with him, how black wealth hardly exists after this, but this is a powerful notion to contrast to what Obama did versus how he basically hurt black people and boosted whites. This is the same Obama that inherited $500,000 from a white grandmother. Let's talk about it while he was in office. No one just gives you $500,000. You had gifts throughout your whole life as if you were a white person yourself. And I'm talking about Barack Obama. We come back to QE. The consensus is that QE was a success. In 2008, the financial system was on the brink of collapse without a means of funding. The injection of money by the Fed staved off a complete breakdown of the banking system. The systemic nature of the banking crisis saw similar programs conducted by the Bank of England and the Bank of Japan. Critics of the QE program didn't necessarily disagree with the undertaking, but more the size and length. With close to $5 trillion in assets in a decade-long period of low interest rates, the U.S. equity market soared to all-time highs. They gave these white stockholders massive amounts of money. And as a result, what you saw, and let's go all the way back, so we talk about it in numbers. As a result, what you saw is that white wealth goes from, if we look at quarter 1 2008, from 66.72 to, we look at it now, and it's at $115 trillion. The only thing that fixes this now is a reparative justice program at the national level that acknowledges that it only is for ADOS people, because that reparative justice program is a direct result of slavery and Jim Crow and the fact that these people have been locked out, oppressed, and foot to neck and stolen from by this country. By law, by this country. There's only one group that suffered under the foot of Jim Crow. That is ADOS black Americans. bar few Caribbeans, because like I said, I gave you the numbers. I mean, we're talking in the tens of thousands at that point, if not less. So we look at this thing and we see the new report that shows how Obama and his housing policies destroyed black wealth. Barack Obama's election marked a significant turning point in American history, and it was rightly celebrated as a sign of racial progress. But Obama's presidency came at the time of economic hardship due to a predatory financial practice that led to the 2007 recession. Cooper and his co-author Matt Brunick cite data from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finances that demonstrates that home equity was important to middle-class Americans of all backgrounds, but particularly important to African-American wealth. The report cites a Center for Responsible Lending study that found that between 2004 and 2008, 6.2% of white Americans with a credit score of 660 and up received subprime loans, compared to 20% of, and they used Latinos, and 21.4% of blacks. So as a result, when this happened, it just collapsed like a lot of black people. But Obama had made sure that those top 30% of white people were okay through their stocks, that the retired white class was okay. And in many cases, well, in some cases, let me say, even the retired black, like elite, I'm talking about the top 3 to 5% of black homes, they were okay through their stocks as well. And far too often, those are the people speaking for the rest of the race. 3% of people speaking for 97% that aren't even of working age, or their children. So we move from federal policy during times of economic catastrophe, which is what we used as an example during the recession, and how federal government decided to help white folks through giving them quantitative easing instead of helping black homeowners, to what do they do during regular times? The thing I want to use as an example, and it's only one example, there are so many, is the estate tax. What is an estate tax? An estate tax is a levy on estates whose value exceeds an exclusion limit set by law. Only the amount that exceeds that minimum threshold is subject to a tax assessed by the federal government and about a dozen state governments. These levies are calculated based on a state's fair market value. Now, they also have an IRS webpage here. The estate tax is a tax on your right to transfer property at your death. It consists of an accounting of everything you own or have certain interest in at the date. Now, what you'll notice is that they have a lot of numbers in the fourth paragraph. They didn't put it in a chart so you can see it good, though. Now, I'm not going to say that they did that on purpose. What I will say, by not putting it in a chart, it really brings about hard questions of why would you make it so convoluted to see what this says. But I'll make it clear what this says in another way. What it says is that when you look at estate tax, what it's done over the course of just our lives from 1980 until now, it has locked in and calcified whites across generations unlike anything we saw prior. So before, white people had to say, picket your house or do a flaming cross, because you could move into their neighborhood. You can get some wealth, maybe get a job, and move into their neighborhood. And I'm not talking about even a great job. I'm talking about a factory job. Well, if you create an estate tax that is so detrimental to like black people particularly, you don't gotta picket me no more. I can't move into your neighborhood because I can't get enough wealth. Myself, I come from basically a single mama. I come from a single mama. Had me really young, 16, 17. I paid for undergrad, law school. I paid for this law school. I got student debt. I got nobody giving me $100,000. I got no gifts throughout life. So now what happens is I can't come and move into your neighborhood. But your white son, who has done half of what I've done, if not a tenth, because you can give him money, basically can have himself move in, and then his friends move in, and then everybody moves in. So we look at this thing, estate tax definition, tax rate, who pays in 2021. The estate tax is a tax on a person's assets after death in 2021. Federal estate tax generally applies to assets over $11.7 million. Now, to some of you guys, that might sound normal, but it isn't. It isn't. I'm going to talk to you about it in a second, because it was only $600,000 only in 97. So everything after $600,000 in 1997 was taxed as estate tax. Then in 1980, it was $225,000. So between 1980 and 97, it went from $225 to $600. But between 97 and 2021, it went from $600 to $11.7 million. In 1916, it was $50,000 when they came up with this thing. So from 1916 to 1980, it goes from 50 to 225. That's less than the rate of inflation. I'll show it to you in a second. Then from 1997 to 2021, it goes from $600 to $11.7 million. The threshold to start estate tax. That allowed white people, that allowed these 15 million white people that are worth more than $1.2 million, these 24 million white families worth more than $600,000 to pass their estates with no tax. So how do you compete with that? They don't break the money up. So you wonder why your school costs money or you can't pay for childcare. It's because white people have the money to pay because they set the whole thing up where they just pay cash. And also, it's not paying cash with this life. It's your grandparents got to pay. That's how life is now. That's why the state tax is so high. So if you're at Howard or UCLA, your parents are supposed to pay for things. That's why the state tax is so high. Their parents didn't have to pay because it was a whole different world. First, everything was going up in terms of opportunity. Housing was cheaper, but also estate tax was lower, so everything got broke up, and government then used that money to make everything less expensive because government paid for school and everything else in the 70s, college, all that. Let's talk about it. I want to be specific. Let's look at the tax chart so you don't think that I'm making this up. When you look at the tax charts, in 1982, the estate tax threshold is $225. Understand that in 1916, it was only $50. It was $50,000 in 1916. By 1982, it only goes to $225. That is less than the rate of inflation. In 2018, it was 11.1. They rose it between 2018 and 2020 to 2021 to $11.7 million. So you don't pay estate tax until you get to $11.7 million. There's only 1 million white families above 12 million. I've shown you that number. So basically, you have about 24 million white families not paying estate tax that should. You know what they use that money for? To pay for that child care that they say is expensive, to pay for their children to buy homes, to pay off their kids' student debt. Tuition ain't high. You just ain't white. That's what I've been telling you. This whole thing is set up for white folks to have great lives, and they don't have to picket us no more. In fact, they'll be at the Black Lives Matter march with a sign while taking advantage of estate tax. I'm just saying. So from 1916 to 1982, the estate tax threshold went from $50,000 to $225,000. Then from 97 to 2021, it went from $600,000 to $11.7 million. White America stopped having to be directly racist. They built it into the wealth. There's no black neighbors to picket. Government was used to cut them out. So you can't come into the neighborhood. From the data I've shown from Federal Reserve, if we accounted for inflation, $225,000 in 1982 becomes $775,000 today. Understand what I mean? That means that naturally, if you just use the 82 rate, the state tax should start. If you just use the inflation and allow that to go up, the state tax should start at like $775. So looking at rates from 1982, white homes above $775,000 should be paying 65% estate tax based on the 82 rate, which is what it was. It's only 40 now. It's only 40% now. That is 35% of white America not paying today. 25 million homes. Come on, man. Probably closer to 30, but I'm doing some rough numbers in that sense. Let me slow it down. The estate tax rate in 1980, and I used the inflation calculator to kind of show you, was $100K lower than inflation rate from 1916 at $225K. Just following inflation, from 1916 to 1980, the estate tax should have rose from 50 to 377. So they went against inflation to basically suppress the ability for rich people to keep money between 1916 and 1980. Then, while the rate in 2021 should start at 1 million using inflation since 97, it now starts at 11.7. So they went the other way. So the estate tax should really start at even if we use just the 97 rates. The 97 rates. We're not going to go back to 80 and 1916. The 97 rates of 600 should be bumped up to 1 million. After 1 million, you pay estate tax. They put it to $11.7 million. They basically said that if you white, you're going to live a good life. If you black, you figure it out. And y'all out here talking about you going to leave a lineage legacy for your children without doing a reparative justice movement that breaks up this wealth. And these banks are telling us, America's biggest banks detail 30 things they can do to combat racial inequality. And they ain't changed that estate tax. That's they customers. And they ain't changed pay reparations by the federal government in the trillions. Nah, they talking about doing some charity and some diversity hires for their diversity inclusion for their staff. Senator Warren continuously uses the word ultra rich. That's their key word that they've decided to describe who needs to pay more tax. It ain't the ultra rich, Senator Warren. It's just the rich. This is her tweet. Billionaire wealth is 40% higher now than when COVID crisis began. But our tax system is still tilted toward the ultra rich. Today, Rep. Joe Brown, Kong Boyle, and I are introducing our wealth tax bill to make the wealthiest Americans pay their fair share. My tweet is, black people should be the first to ask why does Senator Warren keep saying ultra before wealthy? It's because she's protecting millionaire white families that do a version of the same tax rules. The tax system is rigged for the rich white American, not just the billionaire. Now, I'm not saying the billionaires aren't a problem, but I would say it's about 25%, 25 million white families that are part of this whole mechanism of basically using the estate tax to basically transfer wealth that shouldn't be transferred without paying taxes. Let's use Senator Warren as an example. I don't need to go further than that. This is somebody who constantly talks about the ultra rich. Let's just talk about her because she's rich. How Elizabeth Warren built a $12 million fortune. This is a Forbes article. I consider it to be reliable. I believe that they went by her returns that she submits to be a senator. Understand this. I did some math for you to kind of see this thing. Senator Warren's net worth of $12 million using the 97 values with inflation. I'm going to add inflation to take that 600 threshold to $1 million. I'm going to give her first $1 million passed tax-free. That's $11 million left. The next $1 million, because the way they do it is they kind of tier it for about $1 million, but I'm going to use the average of that table to say the next $1 million is at 30% tax. If she dies and she passes it on. So that leaves $10 million. The rest of the $10 million using the old rate, not the 40% that they use now for estate tax. I don't know why they lowered it to 40%. The 55% that they used to use, that's $5.5 million. So Warren's total estate tax using the 97 rates with inflation would be about $5.8 million. Warren's total estate tax using the 2021 rates, where the threshold is $11.7 million, is nearly nothing. That's how they do it. This is the policy that they've used to lock us out. And I'm saying this in context of $115 trillion in household wealth. I'm saying this in context of six that's 4 pension and homes that as black boomers pass on will largely have nothing left within black America. Those pensions ain't gonna pass to you. Legislative changes in the dwindling reach of the estate tax. While the estate tax has always been limited to a relatively small number of estates, the percentage of deaths resulting in estate tax liability has fluctuated over time due to inflation and legislative changes to the parameter of the tax. From the time the U.S. enacted the estate tax 1 century ago, the portion of estates subject to tax grew until it reached a peak in the mid-70s of more than 7%. So 7% of estates are paying this tax. But understand, that means that a lot of people didn't have more money than that. So, the estate tax, if you go back to the 70s, I mean, in 80 it was $225, so in 70 it's probably like $150, and people don't have more than that. They're not amassing that kind of wealth. So now they got to raise it all the way up to 11.7 because too many people have too many white families have $3, $4, $5, $6 million, and they're not going to vote for us if we keep the estate tax too high. They don't want to give that money back. And we've gotten to the point where now almost only 0.06, I think, percent of all families pay any estate tax. This is with, understand, 1 million white families worth more than $12 million. This is with almost 14 million families worth more than $1.2 million. This is with almost 25 to 30 million white families worth more than $600,000. Just saying to you, they don't pay no estate tax. They pass this money down. So if your kid, you want to go to college, has to compete with student debt against free tax, no tax estates, you have chained them to a life of just running against a whole wheel that goes beyond just going to a workplace and seeing somebody be racist at the workplace. They can't buy homes. They can't do the basic things of raising children, not without a whole lot of stress and basically a whole lot of rigmarole. Bill to bill. The estate tax exemption was $600,000 from the late 80s until legislation enacted in 97 allowed for its incremental increase. Then in 01, the first round of President Bush's tax cuts included the gradual repeal of the federal estate tax over several years. The amount of estate tax value exempt from the tax increased over time, and the tax rate decreased over time until the federal estate tax disappeared in 2010. Like all Bush tax cuts, the break from the estate tax was scheduled to expire at the end of 2010, at which time the pre-Bush rules were scheduled to come back into effect. President Obama and Congress agreed to a compromise at the end of 2010 to extend the Bush income tax cuts and partially extend Bush's estate tax cuts. President Obama agreed to extend Bush's estate tax cuts again as part of this new deal. So Obama gives white people, understand what I'm saying, Obama gives white people, he gives them quantitative easing, and then he extends these tax cuts that allow them to pass massive estates to their children. How do you think, while telling us that we can't get reparations, and you voted for him, not knowing any of this? As part of this deal, lawmakers reinstated the estate tax, but with a higher basic exemption of $5 million per spouse and a rate of just 35%. This is under Obama. They reinstate the estate tax with a higher exemption of $5 million. So he's basically giving them more money and then giving them more ways to pass that money without paying estate tax. Meaning Barack Obama. Just 0.17% of deaths in 2011 resulted in estate tax liability. As part of the fiscal cliff deal reached at the end of 2012, Congress permanently extended the higher base exemption level indexed to its inflation, increased the rate from 35% to 40%. At the end of 2017, the Tax and Jobs Act doubled the exemption to $11.2 million. That's what was done under Trump. I need you to see it. It's at 11.7 now. Part of the reason we're talking about reparations is you can't do nothing with, like, you're not going to be able to do much without a massive shift in government now. You can watch all the little chest beating videos on YouTube. You can do all the crypto sales you want. You racing against time now. And them kids is 16 and 17. So I look at one last level. I told you I was going to do 3 levels. The third level is local. Now, I don't have all the local policies. They got quirky ones all across this country. But I want to look at what California did in 1978. California Proposition 13. Prop 13 officially named the People's Initiative to Limit Property Taxation as an amendment of the Constitution of California enacted during 78 by means of the initiative process. The initiative was approved by the California voters on June 6, 78. The maximum amount of any ad valorem tax on real property shall not exceed 1% of the full cash value of such property. The 1% tax to be collected by the counties and apportioned according to law of the districts within the counties. The only way it went up from 1%, meaning property tax only went up 1%, regardless of how much your house appreciated. And the only way it would change from that 1% is if you did major renovation. So you have white people, and I got a neighborhood here, any neighborhood in LA. It's a mid-level neighborhood, maybe mid-upper. And all the houses are from 2.5, 2.3 or so, to all the houses are about 1.7 to $4.5 million. Now, what's interesting about this is that these homes, if they were bought in like 82, 83, could have been bought for $350,000. For those people that say, well, then my mama should have just bought one. Your mama's still your mama, and she still come from ADOS, and we never got reparations. So in that time, I believe you had to put down like 20% on the loan. That's like $70,000. So these white people moved into these neighborhoods. And again, don't forget, homeowners in formerly redlined LA neighborhoods have $500,000 less in home equity. There also is redlining going on. So you have this reality of white folks that may have, and I pulled one home and I blocked out the address and everything else to be respectful, but just to give context, when you pull the county assessor of this home in 84, it was valued at 305. So you got white people sometimes in this neighborhood that bought a home for $305,000, but built a whole tax law system on top of the estate tax, on top of the quantitative easing, where their house went from $305,000 to $4 million in value, or $3 million in value, and they're still paying property tax only on the 305, or 305 plus 1% inflation. So let's just say they're paying property tax on 400 on a $4 million house. This is the way you get down. You see this $3.2 million house, when you can pay property tax on a $300,000 and be in this $3.2 million house, you can go get loans against the house and send your kids to college on that. So you sit next to giggling with Tommy and all that, and white Tommy, and you don't understand that his grandparents sent him here. See, I've seen it. I don't know if y'all talk to enough people, white folks, to see it. Part of what we're seeing is Black America, if it fails to understand wealth, will be crushed by it over the next decade. And it won't even take that long. Some of y'all living like that now. If your kids is driving Uber tonight, you don't really understand how harsh your situation is if you think it's good. I just wanted to come to you, have this discussion about wealth, break down where we're at. We had the announcement of almost $136 trillion in household wealth, 137 to be exact. And white folks have 115 of it, and it was hardly covered. So let's look at it. What should black people have if we had a fair representation against white wealth? Because everybody talks about closing the racial wealth gap, but nobody knows what the racial wealth gap really is. Well, if there are 83 million white homes and 20 million black ones, and understand, even inside of that 20 million, we're including black immigrants. So just roughly using that 1 to 4 and including all black folks, just so you can kind of see numbers. If they have 115 trillion, we should have 28.75. Of that 28.75, roughly 6 trillion should be like stocks and mutual funds instead of 370 billion, which it is right now with a B. Instead of 1.74 real estate, we should have about $4 or $5 trillion in real estate. That means that almost all the young black people should own a home, and I'm talking about a nice $300,000 to $400,000 home. Understand that also, private business wise, we should have around $3 to $4 trillion in private businesses. That means you should know people who have employees. I'm talking about 10, 15, 100, 200 employees. Understand, Black America should not be positioned the way it is, but even that descriptive analogy or comparison does an injustice in one way. You can't keep white people at 115 trillion. They should be more at 90 trillion. So their number should come down, and as a result, we should be more at like 20. But they should lose. See, every reparations analysis, every closure of the gap presumes an analysis, including everything from the economists, if you go look at them in their books or in their studies, to the bankers, the 30 big banks. Nobody talks about white people giving up their wealth. See, they should come down from 115 to 90 to $80 trillion. That is how you do this in a proper way. And it should go again to Adolf's families. So again, that's just basically summing it up, that we should be a quarter of what they have, and they should come down almost a quarter of what they have already to make that happen.